Hi, Becky. Can you hear me?
Hi, good morning. I can.
Yes, hi, how are you? I had having some problems here. This computer was so slow. It's like
That's okay. That's okay. We got time.
yeah. Okay, we're just waiting for Maria who's going to join us.
Okay.
Becky, do you mind if I record the presentation or the explanation?
No, absolutely not. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Perfect. We already have Maria also, and I think that will be it. I don't think Marta is going to be able to join us. So,
Okay. Give me just a second. I'm
yeah,
gonna
no worries. Take your time.
I'm gonna close down my email or it's going to annoy us
Yeah,
constantly.
that's fine. Hey, Maria, can you hear me? Oh, you are muted. Okay. Now, can you hear me, Maddie?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, me. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, give me just a second. I'm gonna shut my door and we'll get going.
Don't worry. Take your time. We're going to do the same thing here.
And me too.
So I know that we scheduled 2 hours for this. I certainly don't think that it's going to take this long. So just Claudia, I just want to make sure that kind of I'm on the same page with you guys as far as just you being able to present this material to a group of folks and then be able to follow up with them for the one-on-one counseling to actually help them with their specific leases. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
We
So
want to
I
be
think
able to, yeah, so at least to understand. I know we cannot be professionals, or we're not trying to accomplish to be professionals in this matter in one day, but at least not to be so lost before we can refer it to an advisor that can help them further. So at least we can do a little bit of due diligence from our end and be able to help them somehow before they can move forward. So,
right. And so that's pretty much how I approach it. So what I do is I will go through a lease with them and I'll go in or I'll have them send it to me in advance. And I'll go through it and I'll make some highlights and I'll make some notes, some talking points for our meeting. And these are the things that I want them to understand about the lease. You know, a lot of it boils down to the money, but there are other clauses that they need to pay attention to. And so it's this, and then I always tell them that they should have it reviewed by a professional, like a real estate attorney, before they make, you know, a commitment to that.
yeah.
But by spending that time going over the lease with them, it allows them to be better educated and to have a better conversation with that attorney. It can also save them a lot of time as far as billing hours from the attorney because they've already had a first look at it. They're kind of familiar with some of the terms. They know what questions to ask. And it's just really much better if they walk in somewhat educated than just walking in blind.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's kind of my approach. So I thought what we would do first then is then just actually go through the presentation.
Perfect. Becky, I gave you the co-hosting power. You can share. Down below it says share. You can just share whatever documents or things you want or you feel.
Okay,
So
so let's get that pulled up. Let's see, I want to share my screen.
There we go.
And then let's pull up the presentation.
Is this Becky? Is this the same presentation that was presented at the? Oh yeah, it is.
It is. Yeah, it definitely is. So everybody can see that.
yes.
And then so you guys, you know, take full liberty with this presentation. I'm guessing you'll present it in Spanish. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. The
Yeah.
majority of our clients are Spanish speakers. So yeah.
So you'll have to make all the translations. Take full liberties, you know, make changes to it. It's yours to use however you see fit. And I think you had indicated that you wanted to do this like as an hour, maybe a lunch and learn type of session.
Yes, it depends on how we want to, but yeah, it will be maximum an hour. We don't want to lose our audience if we do too much or put so many information in there. So yeah.
Okay. And there's not, when you, as we go through this PowerPoint, I know one of you has seen it.
Maria,
Yeah, I've seen it.
But so there's not a lot of words. There's a lot of pictures and stuff. So you're probably not going to lose them. Well, I don't know. It might be boring. I'm a geek, so who knows? So anyway, let's just roll through it.
Yes.
Obviously that'll be y'all's title slide. This is not necessary. Probably. This is just the general outline of, you know, how the presentation is going to flow. So the first thing that we start with when we're talking to a client is called site selection. And this is actually what big box developers call the process when they are looking for best use properties and locations. They call it site selection. And so for your clients, and these are in no particular order, but these are things that they should think about. First is ingress, egress. This is the ease at which they can get in and out of the shopping center. And, you know, I usually make a reference to a shopping center in the community that I'm in doing the presentation. There's always one or two that we know of that are just a nightmare to get in and out of. Places that we don't even want to go. Maybe you know, you can't make a left turn out, you've got to make a U-turn, you know, all kinds of crazy things. So the idea is to have a property that's easily accessible for their customers. The other thing that they need to consider are, unless they're in a downtown, like where it's strictly walking traffic, are the physical car vehicle traffic patterns. And this is important for businesses that do a dominant business during a particular part of the day. And so if you, this is obviously an exaggerated example, although where you guys are, it's not really exaggerated at all. Because I was out there and this actually looks like pretty good traffic for y'all. But so yes. I use an example of this for like I had a coffee shop. So you can see, let's just pretend like this is your morning drive to and from work. And it's maybe it's not even a highway. It's just a normal 4-lane road throughout town. And so on the right, we've got all the commuters going to work. And then you can see that there's very little traffic on the other side because that's just not the way the morning traffic is flowing. And so I always use the example of a coffee shop who does their primary business first thing in the morning. If they were to locate on the side of the road that doesn't have that morning traffic, and how bad that could be as far as sales for their business. So you think about your clients' patterns and their sales and how that could be impacted by the traffic patterns. We also talk about visibility, and visibility comes with a price. So your clients may or may not need to have this high-end retail front visibility type of situation. They're all going to want it. I mean, naturally, you think your business is the best and you want to be in the best location and front and center, but they don't all necessarily need to be paying the high square footage price for a premium visibility. But that's something that you guys will flesh out with your clients as you develop who their clients are. Especially with the visibility, if you've got a client that's more business to business, and it's not really dependent on being seen, that either foot traffic or vehicle traffic, it's kind of like an insurance company maybe. They're not going to get just walk-ins off the street generally. People are coming to them. It's more of a destination, so they may not need to pay for a front and center retail space. Another thing to consider is parking. Most of your retail shopping centers are going to have shared parking. That's generally fine. There's not going to be, exclusive parking in that type of situation, but we do want to make sure that our clients have sufficient parking for their clients. I know that our office is in downtown Savannah and parking is a premium, and there are some people, locals, the tourists, they just come and they stay and they walk everywhere, but there are locals that literally will not go downtown because of the parking situation. So that's something for your clients to consider. Another thing to look at is the tenant mix of a center, or it could be, if it's a single story, if it's a single use building, it could be who's beside it, who's across the street from it, who's on the corner. But you want to make sure, if possible, that they're all catering to the same demographic to some degree. So if you look at this, you've got like a Starbucks, acupuncture, a Thai, a pita pit, and kind of a specialty shoe retailer. So what I wouldn't want to do if I'm a Starbucks, I would not want to be beside a place that sells lotto tickets type of thing. Although when the drawings get to be high enough, everybody becomes a lotto ticket person. But generally, it's just going to be a different type of clientele. And so you want to feed off of other people in that center because you will draw the same folks. The other thing to consider is signage. And when you talk about signage, there's two parts to it. There's what's required generally by the landlord, and then the other part is what's allowed. So if you look at the top little sidewalk sign, that's something that's very, very popular in our area for cafes and coffee shops and bakeries and stuff like that. They kind of depend on that out front. They can write their daily specials and that draws people in. But that's not always necessarily allowed by a city or a municipal zoning ordinance. So you need to know what the rules are where your client is. The other thing you want to look at, if you see that dance and yoga sign, that's called a channel letter sign. I'm sure you see them everywhere. So you've got the individual letters, and then they're mounted on a bar that's installed on the shopping center. Those are very, very expensive, much more expensive than just like a flat box sign that would go up on a center, but those are very common and often required. So when you're looking at a lease and having this conversation with a client, look in there to see what the signage requirements are, because your client's going to need to plan for that. The other thing I love too, down in the bottom left-hand corner, is just that little sign that says breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because it's just so very clear to me what this business does. So if I'm walking down the street and it's lunchtime and I'm hungry, ooh, guess what? Here's a place that serves lunch. Versus if I'm walking down the street and this sign just says Harry's. You're like, what? Who's Harry? Unless your client is a McDonald's, they don't really have that brand recognition. I realize they're trying to build their brand, but I would, in most cases, emphasize what they do, not who they are. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So like if it's a nail salon, I wouldn't want, if Bella's the owner, I wouldn't want Bella's nails. I wouldn't want Bella to be 5 times bigger than nails. I would want Bella's to be small and nails to be bigger so that I can clearly see what she does. The other type of signage too is most of the retail centers have these big marquee signs, and your client will get like one of these blocks for their individual space. Those are assigned based on square footage of the shopping center. Just make sure that your client factors in the cost of that too. That shouldn't be as expensive. And then there are other different types of signage that your client may feel is important, like that little reader sign with the arrow. As tacky as it is, I had a client that had one, And every time she would change her sign, she would just get this big influx of business. So it was really important to her, but those aren't necessarily always allowed. So something that people don't give a lot of thought to, but we need to think about the signage. So when you're in a shopping center or multi-tenant location, you want to try to protect your clients and ask for exclusivity if possible. So here's a situation where things can go bad really quickly. And this is common. So you may have like a full service salon and they're doing everything. And then the landlord turns around and rents another space to a barber, and then possibly another space to a nail service, or, you know, pedicures and nails, or some type of spa type of thing. And so now you've got 3 people or 3 businesses that are cannibalizing from each other a little bit. And we want to try to reduce that so you can have your client ask for exclusivity. So let's talk about restaurants for a minute. Restaurants, you're not likely to get an exclusive to be the only restaurant, but you could get an exclusive to be the only sandwich shop, or the only ice cream place, or the only Latin food place, if that makes sense. Having multiple restaurants in a shopping center isn't a bad thing. They kind of feed off of each other, but you certainly wouldn't want 2 Mexican restaurants that were in direct competition. So we would just ask the landlord for some protection on that.
Is that easy to do, Becky? It's like it is easy to negotiate something like that. But I will also think that the majority of those like corner malls or mini malls, like I call them, they normally do have those type of rules and regulations that they will have the non-compete and stuff like that, no?
Yeah, sometimes. Just depends on how sophisticated the landlord is. I mean, I've dealt with everything for people that just want to go out and build this little tiny strip center or whatever, and they don't care. They just lease it to whoever they feel can pay the rent. But I mean, that's damaging for the center. It's damaging ultimately in the long run to the landlord.
Yeah.
So anybody that has any level of sophistication is going to understand this. And we're going to look at a lease sample before we hang up that kind of defines this, and I'll show you what it looks like in an actual lease.
Perfect, thank you.
The other thing that your clients need to think about is zoning. So when they're looking at a commercial space, you know, sometimes the landlord is showing them the space, or sometimes a realtor is showing them the space. It's automatically presumed that it's zoned properly for that business, which may or may not be true. So you have to do a little investigative work on this. So there are a couple of, and you know, your zoning ordinances may be written a little bit differently than ours, but generally they all follow the same tone. So here we have a couple of classifications where it's a permitted use. That's just flat out, you can have this business here. The complete opposite is flat out, no, you cannot have this business here. And then there are some conditional uses. And then there are opportunities, if it's not allowed, some cases you can apply for a zoning variance. But if you don't know what the zoning is to begin with, you don't know where you stand with this classification. In addition to the actual zoning, so let me give you an example. Let's go back to zoning, and let me give you an example of this. So I had a veterinarian who wanted to do, she branched out on her own. She wanted to do a alternative dog therapy center, and she also wanted to have a doggy daycare, which is super popular these days. And she, I went through several pieces of property with her, and I cautioned her and cautioned her. And even on the last property that she chose, you know, she assured me that the zoning had been thoroughly looked at, that it was a permitted use, and the realtor knew what he was doing, and her husband knew what they were doing. And so all of this, and they got down to the end of closing the project. And I mean, we're talking like a $2.5 million deal here. And to the extent that they've already spent about $100,000 on architectural and site plans and all this. Well, come to find out, it was a permitted use, but she had to have a variance because it wasn't 150 feet away from the closest residential property. So you just have to be careful. You really, really have to vet this out. And every municipality, wherever your client is, whether it's county or city or whatever, they're gonna have a zoning department that someone can go down, that your client can go down and talk to about this, just to double check. Sometimes it's just clear, but sometimes it's not so clear.
Okay.
So then there are other issues in addition to the zoning that are more of building compliance issues. And let's see, where do we go from here? Oh, okay, we just go through them. So the first thing is the American Disabilities Act, and this is making sure that the space is handicapped. So what's going to happen is this is how it happens here. When a client opens up a business at a new location, even if it was, let's say if it's a clothing store, and it was a clothing store before, but my client who's opening this new clothing store still has to apply for a business permit at this location. And that's going to trigger the business permit office to do an inspection often of the space. And so you can't assume that just because a previous business was allowed to be in there that was similar, that it's still going to meet the current codes when your client tries to get a business license there. So, you know, if it's not handicap accessible and they go to pull a business license, they may make them bring it up to code. If it doesn't have a sprinkler system and it needs one, they can require that. If it doesn't have enough bathrooms, if they determine that the occupancy load for that type of business is too small, then they may not approve the space. You also have to look at like fire escapes, exits, as well, of course, you know, if we're being regulated by the health department, then that's a completely different department. Or in the case of like prepackaged foods or bakeries, might fall under Department of Agriculture. So this gets kind of really into the weeds with it. But once again, most municipalities are going to have someone in the building department that can approve or review a location with your client. And all of this is just pre-work before they sign a lease, now making themselves financially responsible, and then coming to find out that they have to spend $25,000 to bring this location up to code. If we know in advance, then that's something that we can negotiate with the landlord to have him help with the code compliance issues, so that it's not all coming out of your client's pockets. Does that make sense? That's a lot. Does anybody have any questions about that?
No, it is a lot.
It is a lot.
It is a lot. But this is so good because it's kind of like the basic explanation on what they need to look at. So I love it. So,
yeah,
it is a lot, but that's fine. This is super good. So,
but the idea is for them to be aware of the issues and then look into it, either with a real estate lawyer or with, you know, with the landlord. But if they don't know, then it becomes a big problem later on.
Right, and that's the problem. I think that so many of these folks are so excited and they just want to run out and start their business, and they find a great location and they're ready to go sign the lease. And, you know, they don't have any background in any of this. They've never been exposed to it. They don't think about any of this, and especially sometimes then you've got a little bit of a language barrier too. And, this can result in some really, really big issues. So even if you're doing this as a 1-hour presentation and they have the opportunity to get exposed to this, it'll trigger. They may not remember exactly what you said about it, but they'll remember that there's something about it that they need to think about and something that they need to call you about and ask.
Yes, at least the basics, because yes, you're right. They get so excited about signing a lease, and we already have so many of those examples happening with our clients that, of course, then they are in such a mess that now they don't know what to do, and is taking 6 months before they can even open because they didn't look at the things correctly. So
exactly. Yeah. And it's hard enough to open a business and be successful anyway, but when you're opening it, already with a big cash flow problem because it's $25,000 or $50,000 more to open than you thought it was going to be, then that's not setting up for success. So, okay. So what else do we have? So then we go into a general discussion about the actual structure of the lease and the money. There's so many ways to skin a cat on a lease structure. It can really be done any way. Anything is legal as long as the parties agree to it. And so these are the typical types of lease structures that you see. So a gross lease is just all-encompassing, everything. That includes their utilities, property taxes, insurance. It's just a flat, you're going to pay $5,000 a month, period. That's what you pay. This is more common in an office building, like a shared office building, where there's like elevators and that type of thing. You're more likely to see this where units are independently metered for electricity and that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And everybody just participates in like a percentage of the shared spaces or whatever. So you'll see that gross lease, or sometimes we call it a full service lease. And that's more common in that type of situation. But you do see it in retail too. Sometimes, the landlord just says it's just $5,000 flat a month. What is most common is the second one, the net lease. And we call it a triple net. Well, we'll get to that in a minute because there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat on that. But what the net lease, basically the premise of that is you're going to pay your base rent and then you're going to have additional charges, additional rent that's due for additional things. And then the other type of rent is a percentage rent. And this is where you're going to pay your base rent per square foot. And then at some point, at some level of sales, the landlord is going to want a percentage of your sales. And then there's a combination. So you can mix all these up and combine them into any form that you want.
Normally, which type of businesses will have a percentage rent lease structure?
So normally a business that is probably going to have high impact sales. So like maybe a Ben & Jerry's franchise, or maybe even a Starbucks or something. Okay. The landlord this is usually a larger tenant that they anticipate is going to have, $1 million or more in sales a year. And the landlord wants to structure the lease in such a way that the more they sell, the more he makes. It's not so common with your smaller tenants, but when I say small, I'm not talking about the amount of square footage that they take up, because the Ben & Jerry's is relatively small. But I'm talking about like small, like an independent type of business. So it's not as common.
Okay. Thanks.
So in the case of the sales, they have to have access to their numbers then.
Yes, and we're going to look at that too.
Okay.
And that's a real pain. So Yeah, well, I'll show you a lease that's a percentage lease, and it's just a headache. In fact, I think it was a Ben and Jerry's. But so anyway, the gross lease, just real quickly, will typically include the utilities. It'll include all the cleaning, the maintenance, taxes, and insurance. This is also called that full service lease, typical more in like an office building type. But it could be a gross lease, but probably on a gross lease on a retail center, there's not going to be cleaning and maintenance on the interior of the shop, just the exterior. And so here's your triple net, and or it's also called tie cam. So just so you're familiar with those two terms, triple net or tie cam, it's pretty much the same thing. So the nets are, so you both start with your base rent. And then the nets are CAM, which is common area maintenance charges, and then taxes, which are not your client's business taxes, but these are property taxes on the place that they're renting, and then the insurance. And once again, this is not your client's business insurance. This is the property insurance. So TICAM is simply taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So either those terms are interchangeable. And so what you really want, let's see what this next screen is. Okay. So what you really need to make your clients understand, and we'll look at an example of this too, is that, you know, a lot of times they'll see a clause in a lease that'll say, you know, responsible for insurance or taxes. And it's real easy for clients that are not savvy. They'll say, well, of course I'm going to pay my taxes, or of course I'm going to have insurance on my business. Yeah, there may be some limitations or requirements for that in the lease, but what they're talking about is what percentage of the property taxes and what percentage of the property insurance is going to be passed on to your client. And this is done on a pro rata share of the entire unit or the entire building. So let's say that you've got a little strip center that's 10,000 square feet, and your tenant or your client is renting 1,000 square feet, so they occupy 10% of the total building. Well, they're going to be responsible for 10% of the property taxes, 10% of the property insurance, and 10% of that common area maintenance. And that common area maintenance should include dumpsters, trash removal, lighting, landscaping, parking lot maintenance, exterior maintenance. That's your common area maintenance. Questions about that?
Not from my side.
No.
Okay, we'll look at it in an actual lease so you can see how it looks.
Perfect.
And then so at this percentage rent, I don't want to get into the weeds with this, and it's really easy to get in the weeds. So I think let's leave it as if I'm going to show you a little example so you'll know, you'll spot it when you see it. But if you get to a lease that's a percentage rent lease, just go ahead and call me or email me and let's look at it together. That would be the easiest because it's not that common. And it's just so many different calculations to it that we could go all day and it may not make sense unless you actually have one in front of you. So I'll show you an example one, and then if you get a hold of one, you just let me know. Is that okay?
Good, no problem.
Good, yeah.
So there is a rent calculator tool. This is not something that you would share with your clients, you know, especially during that 1 hour presentation. So definitely probably take this slide out, but it is something that I can show you guys how to use really quickly. It just makes your life a little bit easier when you're doing calculations.
Okay.
So now we kind of understand the basics, and now we talk to our clients about actually being able to negotiate this lease and what can they actually negotiate. Well, the first thing that they need will probably be negotiating is the term of the lease. There's two sides to this. I know clients don't want to lock in longer, you know, for a really long term in the beginning, especially if they're not sure about the viability or success of this business. On the other hand, the worst thing to happen is for them to be wildly successful and end up not being able to stay there. So you can fix this problem by manipulating the terms of the lease as far as the initial period and then renewal options. So your client may only want to sign a 3-year renewal option, a three-year initial, but we could back that up by 2 to 3 5-year renewal option periods. So the presumption behind that is if they make it to that 3rd year mark and they're doing very well, then they want to stay, then they may want to go for a longer time commitment, like a 5 years. Once again, this is anything that you negotiate it to be. It could be a 1 year with 21-year options. It could be a 3-year with 5 3-year options. But this is something that you kind of would want to do some counseling with the clients as far as when you're looking at like their business plan and their financial projections. This is, you know, part of that equation. And the other thing just worth mentioning, you probably have run into this, if your clients get any type of loan, particularly if they get an SBA loan, it is required that they have the ability to stay in that space for the life of the loan. If it's not an SBA loan, a lender is still gonna want them to have the ability to stay in that space for the term of the loan. So it can be any combination of initial plus renewals. So if it's a 10-year loan, any combination of those two that gives them the ability to stay there for the full 10 years. The other thing we talk about are responsibilities, and you'll see this in a couple of the clauses that we'll look at in a lease, but it's just really important to look through this lease and say, okay, what are the tenant responsibilities and what are the landlord responsibilities? And you would think intuitively that it would all be fair and it should be very easy to understand, but it's not. And the reason that I use this little illustration here is because that's an HVAC, heating and cooling unit. And that's something I can show you a clause in a lease, but that's one of the things that it's a major system of a building, and it's something that you would think that the landlord would be responsible for if it breaks and has to be replaced. But if you look at the majority of leases, you will find out that actually the tenant is 100% responsible for replacing this unit if it goes out. So that could be a big expense, and it's just something that you can negotiate with a landlord, and if you can't, then your tenant needs to know what the financial obligations are. The other thing you can negotiate are allowances. So when you have a developer or a landlord with these shopping centers, they generally have a built out allowance. So when they do a shopping center pro forma, they will put in X amount of dollars for tenant improvements. So they may allow 4% or $4 a square foot for tenant improvements. It's actually built into their internal financial projections. They call it a pro forma for real estate. But the landlord's not going to offer it typically. So the best way to get it is to ask for it. But it's not uncommon, and your client should be asking for it, and they should push for as much as they can possibly get. Obviously, the stronger the client, the more financially strong and the more financially feasible the business is perceived, the greater allowances they're going to get. I'll also put conditions in here because I think somebody said it earlier, like it took 6 months for him to open and it was just a nightmare. And so he's already behind the 8 ball. Well, one of the conditions that I want to make sure that my clients don't start paying rent until they physically open. Another condition here could be that the unit be delivered in compliance with current building codes. But you would really only know that if you had the building department look at the space and told you that it wasn't in compliance. So it goes back to our initial, you really need to do that investigation. So let's just look at a few other things. These are some provisions that you will see in every single lease. I'll show you some examples of some of them. The first one is assignment. Almost every lease has a provision for a tenant to assign the lease to someone else. Maybe they sell the store or it's just not working and they want to close, but they can't get out of the lease, so they assign it to someone else. So you'll have that provision in the leases, but you're also going to have something in the lease that generally will say that regardless of whether the landlord approves the assignment, it does not release your client from any of the terms or conditions of the lease. So meaning that they think that they've assigned this lease and they're walking away, no liability, which is not the case. They actually have full liability if the person that it's assigned to defaults. Which leads us to default. I do not get into the weeds on these default clauses because, oh my gosh, it is so legalese. It's very, very hard to understand. But what you would want to look for is where the default can be cured, meaning the physical location, and what's the length of time to cure a default. And you're just basically looking for anything that seems unreasonable, like 3 days to cure a default is unrealistic. And the other thing would be the physical location. So I know, you know, these real estate developers, they have properties all over the world. We're all over the country. And so you may have a real estate development company that's got properties in California whose headquarters is in Miami. And you may have a clause in there that the default is to be cured in the county of the landlord's headquarters or business. Well, that's not going to work. I mean, what's your client supposed to do? Travel to Miami to go to court for default? No, so we always want the default to be cured in the county or municipality where the physical property is located. So just kind of look for that. There's also another clause in all leases that's called severability. And what this means is that every clause stands independent of itself, meaning that if one party does something that's not in accordance with the lease, it doesn't break the lease. It doesn't change the terms of the lease. All the terms of the lease are still enforceable. And a good example of this is, you know, you get clients that get upset with their landlords and they say, well, the landlord's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, whatever that may be. They're not dumping the dumpster enough, or the parking lot lights are out, or whatever they're mad at the landlord for. So they say, well, I'm just going to quit paying my rent. I'm not going to pay my rent until the landlord fixes this. Well, you can't do that because those are two separate things. They're severable, meaning they're totally independent of each other. And just because the landlord's not doing what the tenant thinks he should be doing, the tenant still has to pay their rent. If they don't, then they're going to go into default. And that starts another whole chain of events. So just for you guys to be aware, I get clients come in here mad at their landlords all the time. I'm like, so what? You still have to pay your rent. I don't know what else to tell you. If it's bad enough, they can retain an attorney, and they may be able to make an arrangement where the rent is paid in escrow. until the issue is resolved. But that's not something that your clients can take on their own. Then here are some other things that I'm going to show you, but insurance requirements. So we talked about the client having to pay for his pro rata share of that property insurance, but also within the lease, there's going to be a clause for the minimum coverage requirements that your client has to cover for his business. And in this case, you just want to look for things that are excessive. So a common business insurance is going to be $1 to $2 million in coverage. When you start seeing things like $3, $4, and $5 million in coverage, we need to know why, and we need to, for your tenant or your client to get a quote on that before they sign the lease. So I had a client that had a, this was before he was my client, signed a lease, got into this space. Oh my gosh, it just went so wrong, so many different ways. Basically everything I'm telling you, he did wrong. And we were sitting down and looking at his financials, and I kept seeing this huge just amount for insurance. And I said, what is this about? And he said, well, I was going to have you take a look at my lease because I didn't think about it at the time, but there was a requirement that I carried a $5,000 per occurrence, and in order to get that policy written, it had to be written by Lords of London, and it was costing him like $25,000 a year for that coverage. It was excessive. So we're just looking for outliers here when we're talking about these types of things. Another clause that you're going to see in a lease is called abatement. And what that means, abatement basically means free rent. So at the front end of a lease, when we're negotiating with a landlord, we're asking for rent abatement. We don't want to pay rent until a particular time. We don't want to pay rent until our business gets open, or we may want 3 months of rent abatement to get us, you know, a good start. We may want some reduced rent abatement. Those are all negotiating points with the landlord. You may have him, you know, graduate the lease up until maybe the client's not even paying the full rent until month 3 or 6. All up for negotiation. But there's an abatement clause in the lease that says, sometimes it says that if there's damage to the premise and your client cannot operate in there, that the landlord will typically have 180 days to restore the property to get the tenant back in. And during that time period, rent will be abated for your client. So the property is destroyed. I don't know, it could have been a big leak or a lot of water damage or whatever. They're out for 2 months while the landlord is getting the property fixed, and they should not be paying rent during that time. That would be normal, but not always. So I'm going to show you a clause when we get to it that totally contradicts that. But while we're talking about this, we need to talk about the liability of your client not being able to operate for a period of time. So if the lease says that the landlord has 180 days to get the property back into the hands of the tenant operational, so a couple things are at play here. So going back to that severability clause in the lease. So yes, the client has rent abatement, so he's not paying rent during that period of time, but he's also not out of the lease. He's still responsible for the terms of the lease. So, you know, if we've got a 5-year lease and this happens, we have a huge water problem in year 2 and it's 3 months to put the shopping center back together, well, your client can't just go look for another space because he's still obligated to this space. And so that goes back even into more insurance needs for your client. They got to have some pretty robust business loss of interruption insurance. So it's another person. I think that for somebody that's getting into a lease, you've got a couple key people that you would want to be on their team. Obviously, that real estate attorney who, you know, would take a fine look at all of this stuff, and then also an insurance agent who's going to make sure that your client has the proper coverage and is protected as much as possible for whatever situation arises. Like, you guys have earthquakes out there, right? Yeah. So, you know, an earthquake could cause major structural damage, which could take months and months to fix, and your client's just out of business. And like I said, he can't just go rent another space. He's still
and now we have the fires too, to add it to all this.
Right, the fires. Yeah. So, I mean, here we have hurricanes. But, you know, I think everybody, you know, out in the Midwest, they got tornadoes. Everybody's got something that could potentially put our clients out of business for a good period of time.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that their financial requirements stop. So, and they still have their bills to pay. So it's a problem. So we just need to really hammer in that insurance proper coverage.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to look for in a lease is hours of operation. And so this is common in these shopping centers, that the landlord will stipulate the hours of a shopping center and the hours that your tenant or that your client will need to be open. Sometimes this is not negotiable, but sometimes it is. And I'll give you a case in point. So I have a salon, a high-end salon, that was going into a shopping center that had, I mean, it's just like a normal shopping center. It had restaurants and retail stores. And we all know that salons are typically closed on Mondays. And a high-end salon is not going to be open at 10 o'clock at night. And so we were able to, but the kicker was she wasn't even paying attention to the required hours of operation in the lease. Just so much of the stuff that you can just glaze right over and not even pay attention to. And so I pointed it out to her and I said, hey, you know, this is this hours of operations of this center, and this is in your lease that you're going to be open. Were you planning on being open all these hours? And she was horrified and she said, no. I said, well, okay, then we better have this conversation with this landlord. And, you know, the landlord was okay with it, but she would have been stuck with it if she hadn't have negotiated that. And so let's talk about the structure a little bit of the lease, or the legal structure. The first thing that I advise that the clients do is they want to have that separate legal entity to give them some personal protection, not just from the lease, but from other normal business operations. But definitely before they sign the lease, we want the legal entity to be created, because then we want the lease should be in the name of the business, not in the name of your client. So ABC LLC is the business. That's how the lease is made. And then your client will sign on behalf of the business, whether it's an S Corp, maybe they're the president, or if it's LLC, they're the managing member. So everything, and this goes kind of to insurance too, everything matches. The business is the tenant. The business is the insured. The business is who does business with these clients or customers, not your client. Your client is removed away from that. So that's all good. Never in the name of the individual. However, oops, that was the end. However, down here, if you look in that little tile that's number 3, most landlords are still going to require a personal guarantee. And that's just going to be an addendum to the lease. You know, you may or may not get away with it. It just depends. When we had property developments, most of our tenants were required to sign personal guarantees. The tenants that did not have to sign personal guarantees were businesses that had been in operation for a long time and had very strong financials that they could bring and prove to the table. And then in a few cases, we didn't require that personal guarantee, but it's normal. You know, don't let your client freak out when it gets thrown out there.
And by personal guarantee, what do you mean exactly?
So they'll sign the name, the lease will be in the name of the business. They'll sign the actual lease as their capacity for the business, like managing member or whatever the case may be.
Oh, okay.
But then there's going to be an addendum that says that they, as an individual, are guaranteeing the lease. And that's just so, I mean, landlords aren't stupid. I mean, they know if they don't get that personal guarantee and your client wants to skip, all they got to do is bankrupt the business, and it doesn't affect them at all personally. And so, you know, just like a bank, a landlord wants as much skin in the game as possible, and they're going to require a personal guarantee.
Okay.
Especially if the landlord's financially invested. You know, like some of this build out, or he's making rent concessions, has to go in and do some compliance issues. The more invested that the landlord is into your tenant, the more, or to your client, the more invested he wants that person to be to him. So that's the premise behind the personal guarantees. And that's about it. So obviously you wouldn't have to have that slide in your presentation to your folks, but, and you may want to take out some of this if you feel like it's too much, if it's too overwhelming, or just kind of throw out terms and don't get into more of the explanation. So any questions about anything?
No, everything is very clear. I do like the rent calculator. I added to the documents, Claudia.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that you were going to show that to us, Becky? Yes?
I will.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good, Maria. See, we need to know, but like Becky said, maybe not at the presentation, but just for us, it will be great to see the lease calculator. That would be a good thing.
Yeah, it helps because if you're looking, now here's the thing, can I find it?
I can send it to you if you.
Isn't that horrible? Let's see. Is that? No. Rent the calculator here. Let's just go back to my documents. Do you ever get so many files that you start really don't even know where you put stuff anymore?
Yes. Yesterday I had a little time and I was like, okay, let me put this, let me create a folder called lease agreement. So that's what Maria is telling, that she already put the calculator in that folder because I created a folder. I'm like, otherwise we're never going to find this. It's like,
so I just use this. It's really, really simple if your client is looking at multiple properties, because they're, you know, the base rents are going to be different and the triple nets are going to be different. And so I just, you can just pop in a whole bunch of different properties here. So one might be south, one might be east, one might be west, whatever the addresses are. And you've got all different, you know, never weird square footage prices. So one of them might be 26, 25, and that space worked out to be something weird like 1,620 square feet. And they were quoting triple nets of 450. Then you might have something here who looks like a really good deal at $23 a foot, and it was, I don't know, 1,400 square feet. Then they got over here and they were hammering you for triple nets. So it's just an easy way for you guys to compare these properties without having to do the hand calculations. Make sense?
okay.
And then that'll tell you, because at the end of the day, this is really, you know, this monthly amount, that's what you need for when you're working with the financial projections and the forecasting with your clients. That's ultimately the figure that you're trying to get to, annual, and of course then monthly.
Oh, okay.
And then here's another way that you can do it. So let's say that they had a property that was, it was west, and the landlord did not quote them a percentage, a base square foot amount. Maybe this is a case where it was a gross lease. That's fine if your client is willing to pay that. But the problem is if you don't do the calculation on it, you don't know if they're paying above market rent. Make sense? So let's say that we're looking in this 14 to 1600 square foot range, and your client finds a property that's 1600 square feet, and the landlord says, no, it's just a gross amount, you know, your triple nets, everything is included. It's just this is what you're going to pay on a monthly basis. You're going to pay me $4,200 on a monthly basis, and not zero because it's all included.
Okay.
So what that did, this will tell you the calculation, calculates that square footage price for you. So the other spaces that we were looking at were $23 to $25 a square foot. And then when we added in the triple nets, we were anywhere from 29 to 30.
Okay.
Well, we didn't have that much information on this other space. The landlord just threw out a monthly price. So we didn't really know if we're in market rate or not. So we just threw this in really quickly, and now you can see that comparably speaking, he's at 3150, which is getting to the high end if we're assuming that the top three are the market rates. Make sense?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
typically you're gonna have you'll use the top example, you're gonna have that information, you're gonna have the square footage, base rent, the price per square foot, and you're gonna know what your triple nets or your TICAM, taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. Typically, you're going to have that information, but in the case of more like that gross lease situation, you may not have that, and you can just do a double check on the bottom, making sure that your client is not paying over market rate.
Got it. Okay.
So, but typically, you're just going to be working with the top, unless it's that gross lease.
Okay, cool.
And then, so what's really cool here is to help you. So you've calculated your initial rent term. So let's say that this client chooses property number 2, East. That's the property that he decides to go with. Now, let's say that the lease has 2 years fixed, and then a 2% increase for years. I'm just making stuff up. 3 through 5. I'm probably making it more complicated than it has to be. So let's say he chose, what did I say, the East property?
Yes.
And the East property was at what, $23 for, nope, I'm sorry, let's go back. So we got to use the total of the property. So it's at a square footage. So it was 23. So here's what's interesting about doing these rent calculation on the renewals is that typically the increase is just on that base, not on the triple nets. Because the triple triple nets should be more of a fixed situation. There'll be a clause in there that if the property taxes go up or the insurance goes up, that the client will have, still has the same percentage responsibility. So if he's paying $1,000 a year for property taxes and the property taxes go up, he may have to pay more, but it's not going to be a case where the lease actually says annual increases of 2%. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't, we can look at it on a case-by-case basis when you get, and I may can point out some specifics in the lease. So let's see. East was $23 at 1,400 square feet, and he was paying $6 for triple net. So we've got 1,400 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to have, starting in year 3, 4, 5, we're gonna have, that's all we're gonna do. So in this case, he's signing a 5-year lease. He's fixed for the first 2 years. Thereafter, he's got an annual increase of 2%.
Mm-hmm.
And his triple nets, which we cannot, there's no way that you can predict an increase in that. So we just have to assume that that stays flat.
Okay.
So now when you're doing your projections with your client, there's your monthly rent for years 3, 4, and 5. So just so you don't have to do the calculation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just makes it easy.
Yeah.
And then this really, really nasty tab is for that, and it doesn't even look that bad, but it really is for that percentage rent situation. And so once again, let's take that on a case-by-case basis. You'll get more out of it if you actually have the lease in front of you and we can do it together.
Okay, got it.
So, but we can do any of this together anyway. So
thank you.
Like I said, I'm just like, I get abused here in Georgia for this type of stuff. Yeah, even like I get to like the 10th lease that I've done with another consultant. I'm like, you're milking it, aren't you? You're snowballing. I know that you really know this, but yeah, it's okay. Whatever. Okay, so you want to look at a couple of actual lease clauses that I sent you?
Yes. Yeah. Can we just have like a 2-minute quick bathroom break or something?
How about if we take a 7-minute bathroom break? Okay. Or let's just be as quick as we can and get back, but it's going to take me more than 2 minutes and I have to go too.
Okay, cool. That sounds good. Okay, I'll leave it open. Okay, thank you. María, ¿estás ahí?
Sí, aquí estoy.
Ah, bueno. Que cuando terminemos tienes tiempo de
Sí,
volver
sí,
a hablar. Ah, bueno.
sí, sí, tranquila.
Que no sé si ya llegó el email del YPI. Se acabó eso.
Okay, I'm back. Are you girls all back?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
My bathroom is not that close, so.
That's okay. No worries. No worries.
you were fast. You were fast.
Yes, you're very fast.
Okay, let's really have some fun and look at some leases. So I'm gonna just start with the standard lease that I sent you guys.
Okay.
This is just a common lease structure that we see. And so I had highlighted some things that I just wanted to point out to you guys. So the first thing was the term of the lease. And so this is how I handle my counseling or consulting with a client. I will have them send me the lease. I will go through and I will highlight and I will make notes of things that strike me as odd or that I think that the client needs to pay special attention to. And so this was just, I won't get into the weeds on this, but this was a clause that was just, it was confusing. It didn't make sense as far as when the actual lease began versus the occupancy. And so here's the fixed rent, $23 per square foot, beginning on the commencement date, which was my confusion up at the other clause. And then 3% annual increases. This did not have percentage rent. Then it did have taxes, insurance, common area maintenance of $4 per square foot. And so this kind of goes back to when we were doing that rent calculator. We have a clear increase on the base rent, but you're never gonna, I wouldn't say never say never. You'll see all kinds of craziness, but you're generally not gonna have that annual increase on your taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. It can go up, but it's just not gonna be a specified annual amount. So it's clearly here, it tells you it's clearly on their pro rata share of the shopping center. And so, I mean, you're reading through all this, you're looking for things. So here was just a clause, once tenant accepts possession of the premise, tenant may make improvements. Well, this was a case where we wanted the improvements to be made before we moved in. And so, you know, they were building the shopping center and we were trying to get our plumbing and electrical done during construction. And so that didn't make sense. Here was a example of the hours. So it said that during the term, tenant open for business no later than 10 and couldn't close earlier than 10 p.m. Monday through Saturday. And then on Sundays, this is actually, now that I think about it, this was the high-end salon. And then on Sundays, they had to be open from 12:30 to 8 p.m. And that just was not acceptable. So we had to go back to the drawing board with this client, or with this landlord. So here was just the tie cam. I was pointing that out to the client and explaining to her what those charges were, the common areas, vary in length, those cam charges. So here's exactly telling you, you know, what back to the landlord responsibilities, what's being covered for what the tenant is paying, the taxes that they're paying, the pro rata share of the property taxes, and then the insurance that they're paying, the pro rata share of the property insurance, just making your client understands that. Here's something that I always encourage my clients to ask for, and something that I'd like to see in a lease is that the landlord should provide an annual statement to your tenants for showing what the actual property taxes, the actual property insurance, and the actual common area maintenance expenses are. This keeps them honest. So, well, that's really the only way I know how to say it, is that it just keeps this landlord honest that your tenant's only paying what the actual expenses are and that this number is not being padded. So this is some where they start defining more responsibilities, like what the landlord will repair and what the tenant is responsible for. So, you know, foundation, roof, structural portions, that's typically all landlord. They do require generally that the tenant has additional glass insurance. That's probably just part of a basic business policy anyway. And then you want to look at, in this case, repairs and maintenance by the landlord. So tenant acknowledges liable or responsible for repairs to electrical, plumbing, systems, fixtures, repairs to the air conditioning, heating, ventilation equipment systems, repairs to doors, windows, hardware, fixtures. So this isn't bad because it's saying repairs. I'll show you another lease where it's not just repairs. So that's what we're looking for. This is good. I want repairs only, not replacement. And then this was kind of a weird thing in this lease. It said that the tenant shall maintain the grounds of the property in a neat, attractive condition. Grass cut, shrubs, landscaping, whatever. But we saw earlier that that was part of the common area maintenance. So, you know, you had two contradictory statements in a lease, and you'd want to make sure that one is taken out. In this case, this one. This was kind of just a weird thing that a tenant agreed to use due diligence to keep the sidewalks, outside areas free from ice and snow, broom clean, which, I mean, we're in Savannah. We don't get ice and snow, although it did snow once and we had a little ice. But, you know, I told my client, I was like, this is probably not a big deal, but this just is striking me wrong, because what if we do have an ice storm and there's ice out on the sidewalk that runs in front of the shopping center and someone slips right outside of your door? Well, if you go back to this lease, then you're responsible because there was ice and you didn't keep it free from ice. And now this person can sue you and the landlord has no responsibility. It's just kind of common sense on some of these things. Think through what this lease is saying and how it could impact your client.
Becky, when you're looking at these lease agreements, do you go, so you read one by one this whole entire 33 pages?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, wow. Okay. Like, wow.
But you get faster at it.
I guess, yes. Now I know. Yeah, you by now know a little bit where to like spot all these things.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of know exactly where I'm going with it. I mean, that doesn't mean that I don't read it. Well, and the other hand, the other thing too is, I mean, with you guys, do you have like a number of consulting or counseling hours that you have to do per year?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We have our budget and all that. The idea with us anyway, Becky, is not that Maria or myself are going to be the experts on this.
Right.
Like I said, we want to make sure that we are able to look here and there, because we do have one or two advisors that they can lend us and say, okay, they will help you get a little bit more into it and deeper into all this. It's just that before we do that, because their hours are more limited than ours,
right,
we want to make sure that before we send it their way, we have already looked at some stuff.
Right. And so I think that, I mean, so if you're doing this in the preliminary stages, with a client, you're looking for outliers here in this lease. You're looking for,
and red flags.
yeah, you're looking for red flags. You're looking for, you know, the structure. You're looking at the money. You're making sure that they understand all their responsibilities and, you know, especially the financial responsibilities. And so probably, you know, from your standpoint, what might be easiest is like the first couple leases that you look at. If you, when you get them, if you send them to me, let me take a look at them and just kind of red flag them and say, hey, if I was doing a cursory look, these are the things that I would point out, make sure that the tenant knows and is okay with before you move that forward to someone that's more of an expert and even get them involved, because you know, you may see some things in here that's like, whoa, this is just a deal breaker. We're not going to move forward with this, and there's no use to get another person involved.
There you go. Yeah.
That's kind of how I would do it. I am that person in the state of Georgia, so I do get in the weeds, but I can, you know, I'm fast at this, so I can do a couple with you initially and just red flag it and go, whoa, make sure you get this, 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 and this. These are the main points that your client needs to understand.
Cool. Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah,
and then if it's a go, then you move it forward to your expert.
Yeah.
Remember we talked about the signage? So here's a clause in here that talks about the sign. It says that the tenant can erect the sign, and he gets one sign space on the monument, both of which shall be of size, style, and type that the landlord approves. Well, okay, so what are the sign requirements? Because that dance and yoga sign that we looked at, that's a $15,000 sign. Versus, you know, if you look at a shopping center and there's just like box signs or header signs or whatever, can be a huge investment for your client. So we just need to know. And then other things like this too, like exterior signage, you can't put any decoration or advertising, nothing on the glass or the doors or windows. Well, we got to have something, right? I'd like to have my name or my logo. I'd like to be able to put the hours that I'm open. So, I mean, really, what can we do? This is just, we don't even have to get in this, but this is actually, they're talking about changing the parking situation, and it was just something that I wanted my client to ask about. This was a case where they couldn't do any changes to the lease without written consent of the landlord. And what I really wanted them to do was to have their drawings attached to the lease as an exhibit, and actually make that part of the exhibit so that consent would be there for what they were trying to do to the interior of the space. Okay, so here's that insurance policy, and this is the top part is the insurance that the landlord is keeping on the property that the tenant is paying their pro rata share for. And then so the tenant also is required to have its own liability insurance and name the landlord as an insured. And then in this case, it was a $2 million policy. I would prefer $1 million, but $2 million is not completely out of range. But once again, that goes back to making sure that your client gets this quoted by an insurance agent to make sure that it is affordable. More insurance requirements. All right, so here's that thing about damage. So if the building is damaged, the landlord at his expense will restore it within 180 days after damage or destruction. That's 6 months, ladies. That is a long time for your client to be out of business. And so the rent is abated, here it says, rent and additional rent shall abate from the date of the damage until 10 days after it's fixed. So that's great. You got 6 months you're not paying rent, but you also got 6 months that you're out of business. So
exactly, that you're not working. That you're not generating anything.
right. We got to have a plan here. And also, you know, back to our earlier conversation, you're out of business for 6 months and you don't have the liberty to go and find another space because you're still responsible under the terms of this lease.
Yeah. And you are giving only 10 days after you get back in.
Right. Yeah. So you got 10 days to get, right. 10 days to start making money to start paying rent again.
Yeah.
Let's see, here's a bunch of default. This wasn't so bad. 5 days written notice, 10 days to cure. That's kind of common. Like I said, you'd be looking for something weird, like a 1 day or 2 or a 3 day cure. This is real, that whole default thing, that is legal. Don't really try to get too in the weeds with that.
Under which circumstances a tenant can actually get out of a lease? What would be like a justifiable, if that's a word, you know, a good reason or a legal reason that you are able to get out of the lease?
None.
Oh, okay.
There's probably nothing in here. Well, the assignment or subletting clause, let's get to that. That's generally the only way that your client can get out. And let's see. So that's it. You know, that goes back to that, making sure that that initial term and the renewals are properly balanced. You know, if your client really has any hesitation, well, maybe they shouldn't be going into business to begin with. But, you know, if there is some concern, we need to go with a shorter initial term while at the same time making sure that we have enough of those rent renewal options to stay in the event that we are very successful, hopefully.
Okay.
How easy is to have that sub-rental clause there? Like if I can sublease or whatever my space to somebody else, how easy will tenants like it or not like it? Because I know a lot of our clients, you're right, they shouldn't be doing it if they're not sure. But they want to also cover it and say, maybe I want to sublease a little piece of it because I'm not going to use this whole area or something. Would it be something easy to put in there, or normally landlords are hesitant to allow that?
Everything is negotiable until it's signed.
Okay.
And if you don't ask, the answer is no. Okay. So I'm never afraid to ask the landlord for any and everything that I want, or any and every potential situation that we can think of.
Got it. Okay.
But there is going to be some standard language in the lease about assignment and subletting. Mm-hmm. And I'll probably show you 2 different versions here. So if you look at the beginning of this clause, it says tenant may assign this lease or sublease. So this says the entire lease premise.
Oh, okay.
So if you wanted them to be able to sublease a portion of their space, then you would say sublease the entire or a portion of the leased premises. You would want that added in after obtaining the prior written consent of the landlord at the landlord's sole discretion. However, going forward with this, any assignment or sublease by the tenant shall be only for the purpose specified in this lease and for no other purpose. So if your tenant is a restaurant, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If your tenant is a restaurant and that was the use specified in this lease, and he wanted to be able to sublease a portion of his unit for, I don't know,
For a salon, for a massage in the back.
right. That would be a big stretch, but I was trying to think of something that a restaurant might want to.
Yeah, but
I don't know, tortilla, fresh
or
tortillas, or
a juicery,
bakery.
like doing
Oh, a
making juices
juicery,
or
yeah.
something. Yes.
Yeah, something like that. Okay,
Yeah.
so that wouldn't be allowed unless we forecasted that and make sure that we put that in there. Does that make sense? Because it's saying that it can only be subleased for the use that's specified in this lease.
Yeah.
And so if the use is specified as a restaurant and he wants to sublet for the other use, it would not be allowed in this lease. So you're going to have to watch this language. You're really going to have to get into the weeds, which you do, with your clients on their business plan and what exactly are they going to be doing. And then here's the kicker clause. And in no event shall any assignment or sublease of the premise release or relieve tenant from any obligation of the lease. This is so dangerous because it's really dangerous in the event that your client sells their business. So, you know, they sell their business, the person that buys their business takes over the lease, your client's excited, they made a profit, they're walking away free and clear, and they get a notification from the landlord in 6 months that the new owners have defaulted, and, oh, by the way, you're still responsible for this, so you owe me all this back rent and all rent going forward. That's a problem.
No, for everything, liability and whatever happens, and no, that's super delicate.
Everything. And this, I guarantee, this is in 99% of all leases.
Wow.
So the other thing too is that, you know, just going back to that use. So, you know, just making sure that your client understands that if it's saying that it can only be sublet or assigned for the same use that's defined in this lease, it's more constraining, I guess is the word. So that's just some notes and some things that they want to talk to the attorney about. One way that we've been able to circumvent this is that we've been able to get the landlord to agree in writing and have it added into the lease that the tenant may be relieved from all lease obligations if the unit is assigned or sublet. Well, sublet wouldn't really work, but if the lease is assigned to another tenant of equal or greater financial strength.
Okay.
That's really what the landlord is caring about. He's
at
the end of the day, he just wants his money. And so, you know, if I sell my business to someone and they're as financially strong as myself, the landlord doesn't care. He's, you know, they're going to go on, they're going to sign a new lease, they're going to take this over, whatever, they're going to execute the personal guarantee, they've provided their financials. The landlord's just as happy to have them as he is to have me. But unless it's in this lease written this way, he can keep us both on the hook. And there's no use for that. Are we good on that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Let's see. Yeah, this just goes back to saying that the tenant will put the sign installed within 60 days. And once again, they weren't telling us what kind of sign. So we were trying to do financial projections, and I didn't know whether to estimate $5,000 or $15,000. This was just this was just something out of the blue that I asked for, because this client was putting a lot of money into the build out of this unit, and the landlord had wanted the security deposit and the first month due upon signing. I said, let's just change out the security deposit only, because you're putting so much money into the building. And, you know, the landlord was fine with it, but if we hadn't asked, then she would have had to put the first month up as well. And then also there was another comment about when the rent was actually going to start. Okay, let's look at a couple other quick things. Here was another lease. This is an interesting situation. Like I said, you're just looking for outliers. So I had a client that does was doing an Asian style restaurant, but because of his religion, he would not serve alcohol. And so when they put the tenant's use in here, that's what he told them, I'm not going to serve alcohol. So they said, you know, the sit down restaurant, Asian style noodles, rice bowls, tacos, pan Asian salad soups, and non-alcoholic beverages. Well, that's fine for what he's doing, but this is a franchise who really strangely gave him this exclusion not to serve alcohol. But what if he sells this business? That's just his religious preference. So the new owner is very likely going to want to sell alcohol in this thing. So I was like, whoa, let's not say just non-alcoholic beverages. Let's leave this open in case we want to sell our business. Nobody's going to buy a restaurant that they can't sell alcohol. Or at least not in Savannah. That's all they do. So was there anything? So remember when you asked me, we were talking about having to, like if you were doing the percentage rent or you were doing it on sales, having to provide that financial accounting?
Yes.
Well, you do. And here, this was odd in this clause because it had a sales where it was talking as if where he was going to pay a percentage rent. And it actually had a clause that the tenant agreed to accurately record all sales with generally accepted accounting practices, to maintain records, summarizing all transactions, and that he would have to report those. And I'm like, whoa, why are we having to provide our sales? Because we're just paying rent. We're not paying a percentage of our sales. I don't want my client to have to go through all of this. I mean, it had to give a written statement to the landlord on the 15th of each month for their.
And this is not a percentage.
And
rent.
it wasn't it wasn't a percentage rent situation.
Wow. Oh, wow, yeah.
I'm like, no, I don't think I want to do that. So we had it, you know, if you percentage rent, yeah, you have to do it. I get it. But in this situation, it didn't make sense. It was just more burden on my client and more landlord in his sticky business than he needed to be. So we had that taken out. Okay, so here was a lease that was presented, and he said that this back to the hours, that the tenant would have the premise operate during all the hours that the shopping center is open continuously. But the landlord wasn't telling us what the hours were. I'm like, you can't sign a lease saying that you'll be open for all these hours when they're not even telling you what the hours are. Come on, let's think about things. I mean, he was probably fine with the hours because he's a restaurant, but you know, he doesn't want to, like if he wouldn't want to be open at 9 o'clock in the morning because he doesn't start serving, he only serves lunch and dinner. So keep and maintain in good order, condition and repair. Okay, so including replacement and restoration. So remember that other one was only repair. This one included replacement. You know, just fine. It may be what it is. There may be no room for negotiation, but your client needs to know that you're totally responsible. If this HVAC unit goes out, you have to put a brand new one in. In addition, the client had to have a service contract for the HVAC, and he had to prove that he was maintaining the HVAC unit to the client. That's common, and that's fine. Just so your client knows. So this is weird. So we have common area maintenance charges that we're paying for the shopping center, and we've got dumpsters and all this. And then there's a clause in here that says that the tenant should be responsible for the removal of his garbage and provide all common loading areas in a clean manner. I'm like, well, wait. Wait a minute, I don't, let's go back to, this doesn't make sense to me. So it's saying that the cost of this is separate for the tenant's CAM contribution. So what does, I just don't understand it. I just want a clarification. So what exactly is the CAM that we're paying for? And does this mean that he's requiring that this individual tenant have his own separate dumpsters and we're responsible for that too? I don't know, but I can't do a financial projection on a business if I don't understand the numbers. Here was just, you know, the insurance requirements for the tenant, and, you know, I just said to get a quote on it. Here,
that's 3 million,
yeah, that 3 million was kind of creeping. And so I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't cost prohibitive.
So they can just choose a number arbitrarily like that? It's like, I want 3 million, I want 10 million, whatever is my choice?
Yeah.
That's it.
They can, and they do.
Oh, wow.
1 to 2 million. Okay. Here was back to that assignment thing, permitted transfer. Notwithstanding anything contained in the lease, tenant shall have the right to assign the lease or sublet. Here's once again the entire premise. Now this says without landlord's consent to the franchisor. So this is a franchise situation, and the franchises always require that the landlords allow them to come in and take over the lease, which makes sense. If the franchise defaults, the franchisor would potentially want to turn it into a company store or take it over until they could find a new franchisee. So that's kind of what that was talking about. That's a little bit different. But here's, once again, here is that clause. Tenant is not relieved of its obligations under this lease, and guarantors are not relieved of their obligations under the guarantee. So here's something to ask about too. So the landlord, landlord wanted a security interest in all of the furniture, fixtures, and personal property of the tenant as security for the payment of the rent. And he wanted the landlord to be, well, the landlord just wanted a lien on all the assets. And my only question with that was, so this tenant was getting a loan to buy all this stuff. So he got a loan to do a good amount of this build out, and he got a loan to buy all these furniture, fixtures, and equipment from a bank. And so a bank is going to want a lien on the money that they loan you to do this stuff. And so that's what I said. He just needed to check with the lender and show them this clause in the lease where the landlord is asking for a lien, because if the landlord's asking for a lien, it could only be a second lien, because the lender,
there's already one.
Right, the lender was going to have a first position because they're the one that gave the money to buy the stuff. So once again, just kind of an outlier thing that I read, and I was like, So Exhibit B, these were the restricted uses, exclusive uses, and this is where I said, so are you going to be added as an exclusive use? I would imagine, but you need to ask, just checking. So here was a restaurant that it was, you know, they're like a breakfast thing, open for breakfast. 30% of its food menu consisted of breakfast. Then you had a Dick's Sporting Good, and you can, you know, we don't need to go through all of these, but anyway, that's what you would want to see when you start talking about the exclusive uses.
Mm-hmm.
You want to see what the current exclusive uses are in the shopping center, and then you want to make sure that your client is getting added to this list. Let's see, let's close this one. Let's go back to, there's just a few other things. Let's see, did we look at abatement? Oh, here was the extreme. Here's the other extreme to that abatement. So, except as otherwise provided in this lease shall not terminate, nor tenant shall have any right to terminate, blah, 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 nor shall tenant be entitled to any abatement or reduction of rent under this lease affected by any reason. Damage, destruction, anything. So if this shopping center is burned down, the tenant still has to pay rent. So definitely look for the abatement clauses.
Mm-hmm.
And this came from a real estate attorney in town who makes leases for these landlords. So like, get out. He goes, hey, it's my job. I protect the landlords. The tenant needs to get their own attorney to protect them. I was like, okay, fair enough.
Wow.
That's kind of how they look at it. Let's see.
And because they still have people who signs it without
Right.
looking at it, they are like, yeah, we got 2 out of 3. That's okay.
That's right. Yeah, so here was one when we got to an insurance clause, not less than $5 million, and those were the limits. I was like, wow, that's expensive. That's really expensive. I don't know why they are requiring $5 million, but that's, A, we got to get a quote, and B, we got to see if we can get that cut down. At least ask why it's so high. And give us some room to negotiate on that. All right, so there's always going to be a clause, and I'm sure I glazed over it in the other one, but it's just so much easier to see here. Remember when we talked about the like ADA compliance, code compliance, fire escapes, fire sprinkler systems? So this says that the tenant shall, at tenant's sole cost, promptly comply with all legal requirements affecting the premise, whether currently applicable or hereafter enacted. Meaning, once that client goes and applies for a business license, they come in and do an inspection and it's not up to code, this lease says that it's all on the tenant to bring it up to code. And, you know, it just goes on legal requirements, laws, ordinance, regulations, physical condition, occupancy, building code, zoning, restriction. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. So buyer beware, fully investigate this space, this property, the zoning, and all of this to make sure that we understand what we're getting into. Or, well, because if you know, then you can go back and you can have, this looks totally different if you know that it's not compliant. Now you're negotiating with the landlord to bring it into compliance for you.
Are landlords open to have the building inspected by the city before writing this, before signing this lease?
Sure.
Like have the fire department go and take a look to the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, because I mean, every use, every business use is different and therefore has the opportunity to have all these different requirements. So yeah, we definitely want to make sure that the space is in compliance for this business owner. I mean, landlords, they're in it to make money, but on the other hand, it doesn't serve them for businesses going in and not being able to stay open. I mean, they really don't want the turnover, and they really don't want their tenants to have problems. They just want their tenants to get in there and make money and pay their rent.
Yeah.
So if we need to have, if we have questions about the use or the space and how its configuration with our use, and we need to have, the building department or code compliance or somebody come in, the landlord should be more than open to that.
Okay. And if they're not, it's probably a landlord we don't want to be dealing with.
No, you don't necessarily want to get into the weeds with this, but this is just back to that conversation that the client needs to know what's required for his business. And one other thing I want to show you that was interesting. This was kind of so this was a clause in this lease, and it was a radius clause, and it said that tenant could not operate or house a competing business within a certain location of the space that he was renting. So that's kind of like a non-compete clause in a employment contract. Do you know what I'm saying? So it was just kind of weird. So this was the Ben and Jerry's franchise that I was telling you about. So the landlord kind of drew this map of part of downtown Savannah, saying that the client could not open a competing business. Well, a competing business could have been another Ben and Jerry's franchise. And the franchise company may have allowed an additional franchise in this area depending on density or population. So there might have actually been 2 franchises that were allowable within this radius as far as the franchise was concerned. And so if the tenant agreed to this, then he was opening himself up to not being able to be the second franchise in that area, having someone else come in and put the franchise in that area. So it was just kind of an odd thing that we had to work through. I was just gonna look. No, that was it. This was a percentage rent situation, but I don't have all of that. But you see right here where he was willing to give him $10 a square foot for tenant improvements. So, but that was just because we asked. So. Well, have y'all had enough fun for one day?
Yeah, no, this was great, Becky. Thank you.
Yes, and so I think let's just, when a client sends you a lease, send it to me for the first couple times. Let me cursory red flag it for you. You guys have much better understanding of all this. And then if it's a go, if it's something your client wants to pursue, then you can put it up your food chain with your experts.
That sounds perfect.
And one or two times in, you won't even need me. You'll know what you're doing.
Or we're gonna milk you like the other.
That's all right. That's all right too. I don't mind.
That's very nice of you. No, this was great information, Becky. I think we're good to at least try to see if we want to implement kind of a workshop where we give them a general idea of things to do and look at,
right.
This presentation that you gave us. That would be awesome if we could implement something like that. And definitely we will keep on bothering you and using your expertise and your brain.
Yeah, that's good. That's
So
good.
I really appreciate. Maria was really excited, and she was the one who told me, like, no, we need to talk to Becky. She's super awesome, and she knows this
Yeah, she
stuff."
knows a lot.
Who could be so excited about leases at 8 o'clock in the morning on the last day of convention?
Yeah, it
Good.
was very good, and this is very good, even better than the Wanda convention because it was so, intimate.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for showing up. Okay, so you guys have my presentation.
Yes.
Change it at will, do whatever you need to do to it, and then just let me know if you have any questions, and I'll just wait to get a lease to review.